Today, I want to discuss one of the most commonly misunderstood practices within the spiritual community, and this is shadow work. Just me saying the words shadow work, I assume that for many of you, you instantly thought I was referring to you addressing all of these negative aspects of yourself. But this really isn't the full story or picture when it comes to shadow work. And in this video, I want to share why I feel shadow work is so important to manifesting. In fact, not just important, but essential. I want to give a new, clearer understanding of what shadow work truly is, how you can meet your shadow self, and by coming face to face with this shadow self can actually amplify the vibration of your being so high, to such a high rate of frequency, that you are able to effortlessly manifest your goals, dreams, and desires. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Infinity, and this is Magnetize Yourself, where we talk about life, love, spirituality, and of course, the law of attraction. Let's start with a definition of shadow work, and in order to define shadow work, we need to define the shadow self. Because shadow work is all about addressing and working with the shadow self. So what is the shadow self? The shadow self, like the name implies, is anything about ourselves we are in the dark about. Consciousness is often metaphorically thought of as a light. What we are conscious of, there is light shed upon. We are aware of these things, just like we can see everything around us in a lit room. Whereas our shadow self refers to the unconscious, the subconscious mind, that part of our mind we are in the dark about, meaning those thoughts that operate completely subliminally beneath the threshold of our consciousness, outside the light of our consciousness. So the shadow self is any part of ourselves that is outside the light of our consciousness, outside of our own conscious awareness. If we aren't aware of it, then how can we know what aspects of ourself are within this so-called shadow self? We can know because whenever we are meeting our shadow self or coming up against opposing our shadow self, we will react in certain ways without fully understanding why. So for example, when we are self-sabotaging our own goals or dreams, this is because we are coming face to face with a shadow aspect, with our shadow self, with something about ourselves that is outside the realm, the light of our consciousness. Despite not being aware of these aspects, they are still affecting us in very real ways. Which is why I disagree with many people within especially the law of attraction, positive thinking community, who believe that we should not address this shadow self, these aspects of ourself, because in doing so, we are just causing them to expand, to get bigger. What I would argue is that the shadow self already is affecting us. In fact, research has shown that the subconscious mind, in this video, this would be in reference to the shadow self, the shadow aspects of ourself, and the ways in which they play out in our lives actually affect 95% of our thoughts, actions, and outcomes in life, whereas the 5% of our conscious mind, what we would call the conscious self, what is within the light of our consciousness, the awareness of our consciousness, only affects 5%. This also means that when we learn to face our shadow self and to work along with it, rather than opposing and rejecting it, we can take quantum leaps toward our goals, because now we are accessing that 100% of our mind, both the subconscious, the shadow self, and the conscious, the aware self. So how do we know when we are meeting a shadow aspect. Again, like I said earlier, one clear sign that we are meeting a shadow aspect is when we self-sabotage. So for example, let's say you are in a romantic relationship and you find yourself with someone incredibly happy, having the time of your life, deeply connecting with this other person, with this romantic partner, and everything is perfect on the surface. And yet you start to experience these feelings of uneasiness. And because of this uneasiness that seems to come out of nowhere, you start igniting arguments, igniting fights within this relationship. And you are aware that you are doing this, and you are aware that it is working against your goal of being in a happy, loving relationship, that you are self-sabotaging that relationship. And yet, despite being aware of what you are doing, you find yourself doing it over and over again. And you don't know why you keep falling back into this habit of acting. Well, this habit of action you can't seem to break is reflecting a habit of thought. And whenever we're talking about habitual habits of thinking that seem to happen on autopilot and result in habits of action that again are happening out of our control consciously, we are referring to a habit of thought stuck within the subconscious mind, or in other words, a shadow aspect of ourself. Because these habits of unconscious thought, subconscious thought, are there as protective mechanisms stemming from a shadow aspect, a part of ourselves that we have learned to repress rather than addressing it. And this part of us that feels repressed, even though we may not be consciously aware of it, because again, we have shoved it down so deeply into our subconscious because we have learned to reject it rather than accepting it as part of ourselves and working with it. It continues to play out, and it becomes very dangerous when it comes to manifestation, because unlike the conscious thoughts we are aware of, that we know we are thinking and therefore have the power to identify and change, often our shadow self is much more subtle. It can be much more difficult to pinpoint negative patterns within the subconscious mind. Usually, in order to pinpoint them, we must look at the ways in which they are affecting our lives. We can't actually see the root cause right away. Shadow work is simply the art of identifying when we are expressing through action, reflecting through action, or in results in our lives, some kind of pattern that keeps coming up again and again that is unwanted, and yet that we seem powerless to change. And beginning to ask ourselves, what shadow aspect is this pattern of action or pattern of results in our lives? What shadow aspect of ourselves could this be rooted in? What subconscious thought could be causing this to play out over and over in our lives? So in the case of the relationship we discussed earlier, the relationship in which you are self-sabotaging, you must sit with these feelings of uneasiness. Why are you uneasy with being so happy and content with this relationship? Ask yourself, when in the past, possibly and most likely in childhood, has it been dangerous for you to feel comfortable within a relationship? Have you been adjusted to feeling uneasiness within your close relationships? Because so often, the reason we have these shadow aspects, these negative subconscious habit loops, really stems back to early childhood and our relationships with our caregivers, with our teachers, with our peers, and in our formative early relationships, even our early formative romantic relationships. Oftentimes, the shadow aspects emerge because within these early relationships, we were wounded in some way, because within these early relationships, there was a part of us that was rejected by this person. And as we saw this person that we cared about, or even that we depended upon in the case of a caregiver, rejecting this part of ourselves, we then chose to reflect their rejection by self-rejecting. And this is when these self-rejected aspects of ourself then become embedded within the subconscious mind, because again, when we are rejecting them, we are pushing them down. We are not actively addressing them or even thinking about them. And eventually we stop noticing them altogether. So now, as we grow up into adults, what we are left with are the negative consequences, the negative manifestations, unwanted manifestations of these subconscious thoughts, of these repressed pieces of ourself we refer to as shadow aspects or the shadow self, that despite being rejected and shoved down and ignored and even unnoticed, continue to play out in our lives on a loop that seems endless and that sometimes we even feel completely powerless to change. And the reason we feel so powerless to change these shadow aspects is because we don't always know where they're coming from. This is why I feel that shadow work is so powerful, because shadow work is the art of noticing ways in which we are experiencing the shadow self manifesting in our lives and connecting the dots backwards, finding the root of the problem rather than always trying to address the surface level manifestations of the problem. Some ways to recognize when we are experiencing the effects, the manifestations of the shadow self, of this subconscious negative programming, of this self-repression. Again, I already talked about self-sabotaging, but there are other ways to recognize evidence that there is a shadow aspect going on beneath the surface. One of these is numbing. So this can kind of go hand in hand with self-sabotaging, but whenever you are trying to numb a feeling, usually through some form of detrimental behavior that you know is hurting you, inhibiting you, or damaging you in some way, but that you participate in because it causes an emotional or mental or psychological numbing, because it allows you to escape in some way. This is a sign that you are coming up against a shadow aspect of yourself. And the reason you are numbing in this way is because you have repressed that aspect of yourself for so long, you are quite literally incapable of facing it. Or at least your default setting is not to face it. But you need to do something to vent what you are feeling. And since you aren't going to face that shadow aspect of yourself, you choose instead to try to escape it. This will look very different from person to person. This could range again from simply self-sabotage, contradicting your own goals, dreams, and desires for yourself, your life, or your relationships, simply because you are reacting to this repressed shadow self. You are numbing it. Another way this can play out is by turning to some form of substance that you understand and acknowledge is detrimental to you, is damaging you in some way. So this could be eating foods that numb you out, that cause you to feel sluggish, that don't energize you and fuel your life or your body, simply as a way to numb out the emotions coming from this shadow aspect. Any substance that allows you a form of mental escape could be an indication that you are coming face to face with a shadow aspect and refusing to face it, refusing to address and acknowledge it. So how can we reverse engineer this, and rather than numbing and self-sabotaging, how can we use shadow work to begin addressing these shadow aspects, these parts and pieces of our subconscious mind programming, in order to begin those very real blockages within our unconscious mind that are preventing us, holding us back from manifesting the things we want in life? The first step, of course, is to identify a pattern. When you identify a pattern, you reclaim your power because you are stepping outside of the pattern. You are stepping outside of the situation. You are making space between yourself and that trigger or that pattern or that wound, and allowing yourself not to simply just react to it, but to observe it. Ask yourself, what unwanted negative pattern am I playing out over and over again? Or wait until it happens, and then in that moment, rather than simply reacting to it or after you react to it, step back and sit with it. I highly recommend sitting and meditating, allowing yourself to immerse in this thought and this feeling until you can find the root of where it's coming from. Because again, only by ripping out something by the root, uprooting these negative thought patterns from the subconscious, can we truly begin to change permanently the negative results we are getting in our lives as a result of that root cause, that root pattern. I find that journaling is a very powerful way to sit with these thoughts and feelings. I even personally have a free journal app on my phone, and whenever I find myself triggered by a shadow aspect, triggered into some unwanted negative pattern, I sit and I begin to write about it. What am I feeling? Why am I feeling this way? And especially pay attention at those times when your actions, the way you are triggered, seems irrational. Don't be so quick to just write it off and say, I'm just acting irrationally. Sit with it and ask yourself, if I am reacting this way, there must be a reason, because I am a powerful, creative being. I am a conscious being. I am doing and reacting these ways for a reason. Have compassion for yourself in the way you are reacting. Know that many times, this way you are reacting that appears irrational is actually coming from a time in which these actions were self-protection mechanisms. These actions may have protected you in childhood, protected you from being hurt within your relationships. They are there for a reason. They served a purpose. So have compassion with yourself during this process. I also find meditation to be the most powerful tool for truly deeply reprogramming our mind, and specifically meditating with subliminal affirmations. I talk about subliminals a lot on this channel, but it's because they allow us to truly access that unconscious part of the brain, that shadow self, and begin addressing it, begin altering it in very powerful ways. So if you'd like to explore the subliminals I've created, I have made over 100 subliminals on my website, Sound and Soulful. You can create a free trial account and access each and every one of these subliminals completely free for 7 days in 3 to 4 different background meditation sounds, depending on the particular track. So many of you have reached out to me and told me that you are experiencing such powerful, profound shifts as a result of incorporating subliminals. And here's why. A big part of why is because you are reprogramming that shadow self, addressing those shadow aspects, those parts of yourself that are stored deeply within the subconscious mind. Specifically for those of you who are just starting out, I would highly recommend my 7 chakra clearing subliminal. This is the same subliminal I personally use every single morning to help me clear my mind, ground my energy, and release those blockages, internal energetic blockages specifically stored within the 7 chakras, those shadow aspects of myself that are holding me back in certain areas of my life. So that particular subliminal will be in the pinned comment of this video. One thing to understand about shadow work is it doesn't happen overnight. Because our subconscious mind is programmed over long periods of time, it can also take long periods of time to reprogram it. However, I will also say that by addressing these shadow aspects through this shadow work, through reprogramming the subconscious mind in whatever way you resonate with most, whether this is journaling or subliminals or meditation or a combination of all three, When you begin to do shadow work, although it does take time and it can be frustrating because you can address something, you can address a shadow aspect and it will come back up over and over again before it is fully released. But what you also need to know is the effects of doing shadow work will be exponential compared to the effects of only trying to change things on the surface, because again, this allows for a very deep shift within you. So although shadow work may take a few weeks, 21 days I always say is the standard rule of thumb for changing a thought habit. It could take 21 days, a few months, however long it takes, depending on how deeply seated that particular shadow aspect is within you. I promise you that amount of time will be infinitely smaller than the amount of time it takes when you're working only on the conscious mind. And in fact, you probably can see this in your own life, because think of all the times, all those years you told yourself, I'm going to change, I'm going to go on that diet, or I'm going to go to the gym every day, or I'm going to not react this way in my relationships. And you may have tried to consciously change that part of yourself over and over, year in and year out, and seen very little results, if any. This is because in all of these situations, you were actually coming up against a shadow aspect of your shadow self. When you begin to do the shadow work and address this habit, this loop, this negative outcome you are trying to change by addressing the root cause rooted within your shadow self through shadow work, you can begin to truly experience deep and, most of all, lasting and permanent shifts within yourself, and as a result, effortless shifts on the surface within your life. After doing shadow work for a period of time, you will find that ways you used to react unconsciously immediately, you will no longer feel triggered to react in those ways. Habits that used to seem impossible to start or impossible to break will become extremely effortless to you, and this is the power of truly harnessing and shifting the subconscious mind. I hope this video was helpful for you in addressing those aspects of yourself that we could call the shadow self, those parts of yourself embedded within the subconscious that may be preventing you from manifesting the dreams and goals you truly desire and deserve to experience in your life. I know that shadow work is not easy, but know that I believe in you. This community is supporting you, and in fact, the entire universe is supporting you on this journey. So if I resonated with you, please subscribe to this channel, join our community of like-minded, conscious, creative beings here on YouTube. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll talk to you again in the next podcast.